Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Welcome to our year-end special, and also the last episode of Season 3. We're at the end of 2025, and I want to take a little different approach today. So we're not doing interviews. We're going to take a look at the news from the past year, developments, that sort of thing. You know, it's been a really busy year for us. I mean, we released our new book in September, Building the Digital Workforce. We just, well, if it ever gets out of Amazon's review, releasing, I should say, an ebook called The Complete Agentic AI Readiness Assessment, essentially a workbook that goes with the Building the Digital Workforce book. We've done over 100 articles on AI in our blog, a variety of research reports, research briefs, all those available on arianresearch.com. Encourage you to take a look at that. Instead of this usual interview format, like I said, I'm going to do a bit of a monologue today. I'm going to take a step back and look at where we actually are with agentic AI after a full year of some hype, development attempts, and some reality checks as more and more companies have gotten involved in and are implementing, looking at using the technology. So if you were reading the headlines at the beginning of the year, January, this was supposed to be the year that AI agents went mainstream. I mean, Sam Altman said they joined the workforce, which I definitely embrace. I think the digital workforce is the right way to think about it. Analysts predicted that they'd handle 15% or so of the work decisions by 2028. Venture capital money, it was definitely and is still flowing. But here's the thing, some of that happened, no question, but probably not always in the way that we thought as analysts and as business people in January. So today, let's walk through a little bit more of what actually happened in 2025. Technical breakthroughs that mattered, what businesses really deployed agents, where they deployed them at scale, how multi-agent systems have evolved from theory to actual use, governance challenges that really shouldn't be and couldn't be ignored, and honestly, just what surprised me and maybe what disappointed me a little too as we went through the year. So let's try to make this practical. I'm going to try to look at some real deployments, real lessons, real money spent, sometimes real money wasted, because if you're making decisions about agentic AI in 2026, you need to know what worked and what didn't this year. All right, so let's get right into it. So it's good to start, I think, at the foundation, right? So foundation layer, foundation models, they are really setting the limits or the ceiling of what's possible today with agents. The big story was reasoning model architecture. If you kind of jump ahead in releases during the year to August, OpenAI shipped GPT-5, and GPT-5 really started to redefine language models in several ways. It wasn't just incrementally better, actually it was different in how it approached complex problems. They've been working on it with their O1 and O3 series, using reinforcement learning to build this chain of thought capabilities. So the model could break down difficult problems into logical steps before it gave you the answer. And that's actually a fundamental change that was essential for moving into agent and multi-agent systems and having them, operate much more accurately. So the benchmark showed real improvements. It's not AGI, but if you've listened to this podcast, I'm not necessarily a fan of the thought of us moving there to the point at which the agents are, or AI in general is I don't know, smarter than humans, if you want to say it that way. That's not really the way we say it. I mean, if you think about the process itself and kind of where we're going, I think what we've learned, part of it anyway, is that machines think differently than humans. So I don't know. When I think of AGI, I sort of think of how do we, improve the performance of our digital workforce incrementally over time, and how do we build this hybrid workforce? Because I don't see, at least for now, that this idea of having agents or machines think like humans or think more than humans or whatever is necessarily the way to think about that. Anyway, so I won't belabor that, but the models have definitely gotten good enough that you can trust them for more complex multi-step tasks. So, if you think about that as this kind of breakpoint into this chain of thought, then Google really changed things from a competitive perspective in November. They released Gemini 3 Pro, and as I've talked about in several of the shows that we've done, legitimately impressive. Strong performance on the multimodal reasoning, math, code, 1 million token context window that actually works, which is extremely important. As we know, context and these context windows have limited, how complex we could, use how complex the process we could use the agents in has been, and of course that's obviously moving forward, and Gemini, has really grown rapidly, 650 million monthly users by October. So that was a big advancement, and honestly, I've been using Gemini more and more. And once I took a look at Gemini 3 Pro, I think the especially the multimodal capabilities, the illustrations, diagrams, covers that I use for my blog posts, etc., really massive improvement over what I was getting out of ChatGPT, frankly. Even the Model 5 and 5.1. So then, the roles really had reversed here. So, late 2022, ChatGPT had, kind of caught Google flat-footed, maybe we could say. Now, OpenAI was scrambling, and I laughed about this. Sam Altman sent an internal memo that was, code red. So, rough vibes, temporary economic headwinds, interesting quotes from that. And, serious competitor, yes. Problems, yes. Gemini, Google had made a massive leap forward. So OpenAI released 5.2 in December, and has positioned that as their most professional use model to date. And, really, as we move into 2026, we're going to see this race accelerate, I think, as more and more, companies need more and more features, need bigger context windows, need this chain of thought, transparency, reasoning. And Anthropic really, also stayed competitive with the Claude 4 family. Sonnet 4.5 is, really the go-to for enterprise agentic workflows. And again, I use it quite a lot. It's been my favorite model for, a year and a half, 2 years now. Not because it has a bigger context window or necessarily the flashiest demo, but because it's extremely reliable and careful. It's transparent, and you can really see its logical steps from one part of assessing a problem to a solution, right? So anyway, that the race has definitely speeded up. And really, when you start to think about getting agents in production, reliability is the fundamental, most important thing that you want when you're talking about this over just raw capability. So, from a technology perspective, agentic applications, the long context window really, became production ready. That was an extremely important advancement. We've had some long context windows before, but they degraded in quality or lost information. So, by now we're starting to see, 200,000 plus tokens that work consistently across the major models. And that's really opened up whole new categories of agentic applications. and how we can use agents in our workflow in our business. So tool calling, function calling got more reliable. It's still not perfect, and if you want to check out, I wrote a blog not long ago about some of the issues with some of the protocols like MCP. The error rates have dropped significantly, but the agent still has to call the right API with the right parameters and handle the errors, going from 60% reliability to 90%, which is a big difference. And 90% gets you from a demo or a proof of concept into a deployment. Multimodal capabilities matured very fast, and agents can now analyze images, process documents, generate visuals, and accurately generate visuals. One of the things I used to get really frustrated about, and I still do with some of the engines, is their inability to spell correctly in an image, or even use Arabic characters in an image. At times I felt like I was getting Russian or something. So that's obviously a big improvement now, and particularly with Gemini 3 Pro. Now it's definitely impressive from a demo perspective. And if you look at costs, cost stories has been remarkable. I mean, model prices, use prices through the API have steadily dropped during the year. And in January, it might have cost you, let's say, $100. Now might cost you $30. So that's a massive improvement. And that also opens up a lot of use cases that we wouldn't really have been able to do from an economic perspective earlier in the year, that now is a viable, reasonable use case. So if we're honest about the limitations, they are important. Reliability is still the biggest issue. Even the best models fail in some unpredictable ways. Maybe they handle 95 similar requests perfectly, and then completely misunderstand the 96th one. For enterprise, for business, that 5% failure rate can be a deal breaker depending on the application, the use case, right? So you can't have an agent that processes financial transactions, for example, or updates customer records if they can't trust that it works every time. It needs to be extremely accurate. Planning over long horizons is still weak. Agents can handle multi-step tasks. Sure, that's a big improvement this year. 5 or maybe 10 steps, with clear dependencies. Yeah, you see that fairly accurately now. And I do that with some of the agents we use in our business often, right? But if you ask it to plan something that takes 20 or 30 steps, with some branching logic, maintaining state throughout, they often struggle. And this, they can often lose the thread, frankly. And they make mistakes in the middle that can cascade. So that's another problem with multi-step processes, is an early mistake can have dramatic impact on the outcome. A mistake at any time can have a dramatic impact on the outcome, of course, but they can cascade into even more catastrophic outcomes. And we still don't have a good solution for agents that learn. That's another issue, right? So how do they adapt over time without retraining them? And agents today, they're effectively stateless. And I wrote about this and talked about this, actually. If you listen to the AI trends or the CX trends podcast, or looked at the reports that are published on the site, stateless, or the ability to have a persistent memory across all the activities you have an agent do, that's extremely important, and it's very difficult right now. There's a very limited memory. They don't get better at a specific task over time by doing it repeatedly, which is what you want, obviously, because they don't have the capability always to maintain that memory, the persistent memory that they would need to be able to do that. So that's a fundamental limitation. Models can exhibit other interesting and problems that we've seen from research. Comprehensions without competence is one of those. They can correctly explain steps for a complex calculation, but then produce the wrong answer. And that's not just a bug, right? It's an architectural limitation of how the models work. And there's a lot of talk about and extremely important technology, RAG, retrieval augmented generation. And I've talked about this, written about it quite a lot. But we're starting to see that that actually has some limitations in this as well, because it doesn't create that persistent, continuous ability for that agent to maintain context throughout its activities, which of course leads to that failure problem and a retraining problem. So, anyway, we did make progress in 2025, significant, right? But the gap between what we can demo and what we can deploy reliably at scale is still fairly substantial. Now, again, it doesn't mean that we aren't seeing great value out of these and businesses are using them to great effect, but it does mean that we have more distance to cover before we get to that place where we can see agents really operate with autonomy across really complicated processes in our business, which is the greatest value that they could bring, right? Anyway, those were the models. Why don't we look at what businesses have actually been doing, though, because I think that's significant. Now, I a lot of organizations have been doing pilots or proof concept, selecting the technology, going through different testing, and in some cases deployment. A lot of pilots. Some of the surveys that we did, and we've also seen some from Gartner and McKinsey and others that show. In our survey, actually, we showed in the U.S. at least 89% of the companies that we surveyed, and it was 442 companies across the United States, across all industries. 89% were involved in some way, from selecting a platform all the way through deploying. Some of the other surveys, I mean, from Gartner or McKinsey, I know we saw something around 60 to 70%. So in the same range, maybe slightly more conservative, but again, kind of depends on what your survey consisted of. In our case, we went all sizes. A lot of the other surveys maybe are skewed towards enterprise, which could give you a slightly different outcome. Anyway, but when we thought about, and we asked about what was in production, though, we got 47%, which is higher than I expected, but encouraging. Now, what I didn't do when I wrote that survey was specifically go into what they were doing with it. I simply asked about them having agents in production handling tasks in some workflows, right? So it could be very limited or it could be very expansive. From some of the other surveys that I saw, they were looking at 15, 20% deployed in production. That was really tied to more complex workflow, like touching customers or critical business processes. So that there's some difference in how you look at that, I think. But in the end, the answer is that companies are moving down this path. They are deploying agents in real situations, and they are seeing value, or they wouldn't continue to do this. But there was a gap, still a gap. Three big reasons really, I think, kept coming up over the year in conversations with clients and in the industry data and the research that we were doing. The first one, reliability. Now, I said maybe you can get to 95% accuracy, which sounds really good. Unfortunately, though, 5% error rate is the difference in running certain processes and allowing your agents to operate more autonomously, less autonomously, and move into more critical processes. So, a chatbot that gives a wrong answer occasionally, maybe that's acceptable. An agent that places orders, updates databases, or makes automated decisions, 5%, that's not good, right? I mean, that could be a huge problem. It could order the wrong things. It could order too many of the wrong things. It could order too many of the right things, I guess. That's where a lot of these, processes start. You start to see the limitations in what you can do. So we have to get past that. One database corruption can really shut down your operation. So the risk is there, and how you deal with them, what we want to do, and obviously we need to get to a much higher output predictability as we were able to deploy these agents. Now, the second thing, integration. You know, agents need to use tools, no question. And when you're building a demo, it's pretty, you can build an agent in days or weeks. You can integrate it if it's embedded into your systems. Like if you're an Oracle customer and you're deploying an agent that's an Oracle agent, the integration is there, right? It's done for you. But if you need that agent to work across a process that touches more than that system, more than your Oracle system, let's say you use Salesforce CRM, that can be a problem. The handoffs can be a problem. So we have new standards that are emerging. MCP mentioned from a tool use perspective. A2A is an initiative over the last couple of years to get a standard around how agents collaborate together across boundaries inside an organization and inside to outside an organization. Legacy databases, security protocols, compliance. I mean, all those things are real issues. And honestly, that's where a lot of the enterprise pilots just simply couldn't get out of the pilot phase this year. Technical debt, integration kind of worked together, and they exceeded what we expected and the expected value of deploying those agents in some cases, maybe a lot of cases. So that's a problem. And then third, cost. And I mentioned cost has come down, but the cost, token usage adds up really fast when you have agents making multiple LLM calls per task. I've worked with several companies that piloted agents for customer service, for example. They saw great results in the proof of concept, but then when they looked at the scale, they realized that if they scaled it to all their customer interactions, the cost would just be astronomical and would way outweigh the value that they would get. Maybe it's more than their whole cost center budget is today. So that we're still not there from a cost perspective, although we are making some progress. So if you look at, where did the agents actually do real work? Where are they being deployed successfully? Well, I think the first one, and the one that we've talked about and you read a lot about, is customer service, right? It was an early winner. It's not, exactly necessarily being deployed in the way maybe we thought it would be, though, because I think, if you think about agentic agency, autonomy from your agents, that's one sort of way to think about agentic. But the truth is that it's a continuum of autonomy, right? You could have very scripted, very logic driven agent all the way to a fully autonomous agent. And what we saw a lot in the customer service world was a hybrid approach, an approach that lets the agents sit on the front line and handle, kind of what we call tier one requests, initial triage, and solving those as well at times, right? Putting the relevant agents together or information together, and then if it's too complex for the agent to deal with, pass that information to a human. And this hybrid workflow has been working really well. A human can handle the follow-up task, human in the loop, we've heard, human augmentation. So it's not that the agents in customer service have replaced your customer service agents, it's that they are freeing those agents up to handle higher value and more business critical incidents with your customers to help you maintain higher customer satisfaction and handle those routine calls much more effectively with those agents. And there's even a move that says you're even with a customer service agent, you want a certain level of autonomy. You want to be able to control that. You also want to be able to script in specific guardrails because we have to protect information, that sort of thing. So we started to see some deterministic scripting languages. I know Salesforce, for example, announced that at Dreamforce this year that not only the probabilistic approach that an agent should have, but there's limitations, and you can draw hard boundaries using a deterministic approach or a logic-driven approach that says don't go beyond these boundaries, which is important. Now, one example that I read about was Capital One. They deployed a chat concierge for auto dealership. customers. And they focused on a very narrow use case. So they wanted to help car buyers ask questions about vehicles, schedule appointments. And it worked 55% or more successfully at converting engagements into appointments compared to their previous system. That's impressive. That's measurable ROI on a specific, definitely focused task that is high value for that customer base. The other use case that we saw that has gained a lot of momentum is code generation. And actually, when in one of the surveys I ran this year, we tested the use cases, and it was a global survey I did for a client for Zoho. And in the U.S., coding was the number one use case, and customer service was number two. Worldwide, though, it flipped. Customer service was number one, and coding was number two. So just to keep that in mind. But code generation, developer assistance is seeing very strong adoption, right? GitHub, Copilot, Cursor, Claude Code, other tools, became standard for many development teams. By the end of the year, if you weren't using AI-assisted coding, you're definitely an outlier. I mean, I know Sundar Pichai said earlier this year, I think, or early this year, that 25% of the code written at Google was written by an AI agent. I suspect it's probably low at this point, but that was, again, earlier in the year, and it's been evolving. So why does it work? Well, developers are experts. They can immediately evaluate the output, especially when you're running the proof of concept, and they can, help define the process in a way that keeps human in a loop, and if this, it lowers the stakes of the mistake, right? If in a customer facing system, it's definitely you're exposed. Dev, while it has to be accurate, coding is an internal process. Bill's an external thing, maybe, but it's an internal process. So from the perspective of adding these coding assistants in and having, your developers be able to QA the code on a regular basis, we saw, very, very rapid uptake and a much more productive environment. The other one is back office operations. It's interesting. I mean, certain things are clearly good use cases that have been easy to demonstrate, right? Agents can query databases. They can generate reports, create visuals. They can answer natural language questions about business data. So they could create a conversational analytics tool. Tableau released Tableau Next, and has been integrated Agentforce, and you're starting to see this evolve greatly in that Salesforce ecosystem. For example, there are others, of course. They work because they're primarily read-only operations, so it's easy to verify. Nobody got fired if the agent generated a slightly imperfect chart, although certainly you wouldn't want to, have that create a situation where you have a cascading problem. So, anyway, so there's clear ROI, lower risk profiles. At an insurance company, for example, that I worked with earlier this year, they deployed agents for claims processing, not to approve the claims. That's a human in the loop process, but to intake information, validate that against policy details, pull historical data, flag potential fraud, and then prepare a summary for the human adjuster. So, 6 months in, they had processed over 100,000 claims, and adjusters spent 40% less time on these routine intake, administrative kind of tasks, and they could apply their productivity to things that really made a difference from a customer perspective by handling claims faster, being able to make decisions faster, and taking away what would have been busy work for them. So maybe that's not revolutionary. It's not AGI, but it is real value and at real scale. So, what didn't work? Well, fully autonomous business decision making, we're not there yet. Strategic planning agents, creative work replacement. These are mostly still proof of concept, experimental, with some successes there, of course. So what did we learn? Well, organizations that succeeded learned, some important, maybe hard lessons, right? You can't just drop an agent into an existing workflow and expect magic. It's not magic. You have to redesign the workflow around the agent's capabilities and limitations. You have to understand those limitations and capabilities. This means that process in re-engineering, which we talked about a lot when I was doing implementation work in the 90s. Well, it's back, right? I mean, maybe it never went away, I guess, really. We have to be able to, it's not just a technology deployment. Remember, this is a process driven approach. And I wrote something earlier this year about that, about moving away from the application approach, which siloed data, siloed operations, siloed organization, into a process driven, which the agentic tools really help you facilitate. But it does mean that you have to spend time understanding and redefining those. Companies that treated it like a normal IT project, it didn't go so well. When they treated it like this reengineering project, business transformation, then the projects were often successful or very successful. Human in the loop architecture still isn't, an option. You can't take them out of that right now. Most businesses and most business use cases still have to have humans in the loop, on the loop, checkpoints, approval gates, exception handling. What happens when it fails? Does you bring human in? That sort of thing. Those are all important questions and things that businesses were answering as they went through the year. Fully autonomous agents handling critical business processes. Well, that's still off. Not this year anyway, but it is something that we're evolving towards, and we have made progress. Cost modeling has been, upfront. It's been expensive. It has to happen because companies really need to understand token costs, API costs, infrastructure costs. It scales differently than traditional software licensing, and several organizations got a rude awakening, as they say, from the monthly bills once they hit production scale. So you have to make sure you do the math before you commit to that production process, right? New roles emerged that really we weren't ready for. HR departments weren't ready for. You need people who understand both the workflow and the technical capabilities of the agent. So it's not just prompt engineering, although that's a useful skill. Agent architects that can handle design in a multi-step workflow designers that can bridge the business to the technical, and these hybrid roles that are, they're really critical, and there's definitely a shortage of them right now. So this is an area that we're seeing evolve very quickly. So one good example, and Salesforce has been a really good example across this evolution, right? They announced Agent Force, I don't know, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, something like that. Oh yeah, October, that's right, October 2024. So a little over a year ago. And then by 2025, they closed 18,000 deals. These are big companies like, Pfizer and Reddit, OpenTable, Saks Fifth Avenue, a lot of them using agents for customer service, marketing, sales. The stock took a hit because of that, because of the 18,000 deals, because I think investors expected faster adoption. But if you think about 18,000 customers deploying AI agents in production in just 1 year, that's impressive. And it's not just vaporware. It actually works. It has market traction. The reason it worked is that Salesforce made it really easy to embed the agents into your existing workflow. And this is back to what I said before. It's workflow driven. They had the distribution channel. They already had customers that were willing to try. They had, good relationships with those customers, and they've old relationships they've had for years, right? And they solved the integration problem as a part of the rollout. Having that platform embedded across these applications made a big difference. And that has turned into what I would say is the successful agent deployment pattern or recipe. Make it easy, solve the integration pain, focus on the workflows, and especially those that already exist in your platform where you have already, where they've already solved the integration process. And then the other big shift, right, is as we deploy more and more agents, we start to realize that we're going to need multi-agent systems. So it's not just one agent doing a lot of things, but it's specialty agents breaking the process up into smaller pieces, right? And so we've moved away from just this generic customer service agent and a coding agent and an analyst or analytics agent. Sorry, lost that word for a second. And started to see that we have to break these up into smaller pieces. So by mid-year, we really started to talk a lot about this, and we wrote a lot about this as we looked at it. How do you deploy multiple specialized agents and get them to work together. So we started, rather than just a generalist, you need those specialties. And so what we realize is that we have to have better standards for collaborative work and even orchestration, how you manage those agents. Um, it wasn't entirely new. I mean, we saw back in 23, 24, Auto GPT, similar projects that did start to work in multi-agent systems. 25, though, this year, we really, started to move from research to actual use cases, actual production. So why the shift? Because building one super capable generalist is just not really the best way to do this. It's hard. So it's much easier to build 3 or 4 focused agents and orchestrate them. So research agent gathers the information, an analysis agent processes it, a writing agent creates the output, and each one does its thing really well, so that you get a much better work product out of it. We saw different coordination patterns or collaboration patterns. Right? And we wrote about that in the Building the Digital Workforce book extensively. There's a whole chapter because this is a critical problem. Hierarchical structures, it's one way to do it: to have supervisors, humans or agents, delegate tasks to other agents, collect collaborative patterns where agents work together and they each contribute asynchronously as they work across the process. Specialized pipelines where each agent handles a stage in the process, so it's stage gated, and then passes to the next. I mean, there are a lot of ways to look at it, and companies have been experimenting with that. The tools started to evolve to support it as well. I mean, things like LangGraph added better support for multi-agent workflows. Crew AI made it easier to define agent teams and their interactions. Companies built their own orchestration layers on top of the model APIs. And the platform started to rapidly create the capability inside their agentic platform to actually do the orchestration inside or orchestrate inside the infrastructure that you use to manage and build and manage those and deploy those agents. But the orchestration challenge is hard, right? Managing one agent, pretty straightforward. Managing 5 or 10, yeah, that's we've been doing that, right? You need messages passing between the agents, of course. They need to be able to communicate, collaborate. It sounds simple, but if you start to multiply this by a lot of interactions and a lot of agents, it can get pretty complex pretty fast. So communication overhead really can limit scale. So state management also another big critical issue. Who knows what current status of the task, or which agent has the relevant information and how do they pass that? How do they communicate that? What's been done? What's pending? A single agent, the state is contained, even though we talked about earlier that it's still somewhat of a problem. But when you have multi-agents, they have to be able to work across. So there's a coordination layer of communication. We started to see things like Slack and Teams, for example, as ways for not only humans to collaborate, but humans to agents and agents to agents and agents to humans. So that's, more and more that we're starting to see that. Conflict resolution, obviously important too. And a lot of times they didn't really think about failure modes and conflict. But what happens when 2 agents want to solve a problem in 2 different ways, interpret the data differently? They suggest contradictory actions. So you need to be able to build in the logic to handle that and figure out how that can negotiate or be handled, or maybe it's an exception and it has to be handled by a human. You have to define that up front. Many successful multi-agent systems ended up with a supervisor pattern or agent, a coordinator agent that manages the team, or a human that does that. But because you're working at machine speed, having a supervisor agent is proving to be a very good way to approach that. It receives the initial request, breaks it into subtasks, assigns them to the specific agents, monitors progress, compiles the results, just like a human manager would. This works, but of course it adds complexity. So you're not just building agents, but you're building a whole management system for your agents. Additional code, additional failure modes, monitoring, et cetera. So what worked? Well, patterns that proved successful in production were, keeping teams small, The most successful multi-agent systems had 3 to 5 agents, not 20 or more. Coordination overhead scales badly today. We have to work on that next year. More agents mean more communication, more potential conflicts, more things to monitor and debug. Simple. So keep it simpler. Clear specialization also really important. Each agent should have a well-defined role, capability, boundary. When agents have overlapping responsibilities, there can be confusion, wasted work, conflicts. Edge cases where nobody handles the task correctly. Asynchronous often beats synchronous. Agents that can work independently and share results seems to be a better pattern than waiting for each agent to work together in lockstep. It seems to be much more robust and efficient. Synchronous coordination looks clean on paper, but it tends to break down under real world circumstances. And honestly, use cases don't many use cases don't need multiple agents. Before you jump into multi-agent, you should ask the question: can one well-designed agent with good tool access handle it? If it's yes, then you know where to go. If not, then you have to look at a multi-agent system for those genuinely complex workflows that have distinct phases or different types of expertise required. But remember, they add to operational complexity, and you need a real reason to go there. Governance and trust, also a big issue. Regulatory measures this past year, landscape has evolved in some ways, and in some ways it hasn't. I mean, the EU AI Act, of course, is implemented and has started to have some impact. Operations in Europe, of course, have to think about that: risk, classification, transparency, documentation. High-risk systems, face stricter requirements. Some companies delayed because of that to make sure that they were in compliance. That wasn't theoretical, right? It was actual. In the U.S., the regulatory landscape is much more complicated, which, frankly, I probably say that a lot when we talk about the U.S. We have no federal oversight yet, and in fact, it looks like, based on some of the recent administration's executive orders and public statements, that's not going to happen. And in fact, some of the states have gone down the path, and now looks like that actually may be overridden by the federal government as well. So I'd say we're very, very nascent here in how the industry is going to be regulated from a government perspective. So the industry's trying to self-regulate. Major AI companies have released, safety guidelines, consortiums trying to build standards, frameworks, real impacts that are, important from a business perspective, not just public relations. And at least the conversations are happening. But again, we got a long ways to go. And then, regulation aside, there's some real governance issues, some real security issues. Their prompt injection, jailbreaking at scale is a concern. You deploy agents that interact with customers and processes, and you got to worry about trust. You got to worry about transparency. Adversarial users could try to manipulate it. Anyway, there are a lot of security issues. Data privacy as well. Data privacy with agentic systems is complex. Your agent queries multiple databases. They need access to a lot of different information. They move that information around through APIs. You have to be able to transparently know where that information is going, who has access, what agents have access, what they're doing with it. And even, regulations like GDPR in the EU or CCPA in California that protect personally identifier, PII or PI in Europe, and sensitive information in general across all those touch points. So that's, it's difficult, and it is something that we're still, struggling with. Audit trails, obviously important when you're deploying agents at scale. What agent makes a decision, what action, what they do, how they get there, how do you deconstruct that so you understand what was done, et cetera. Liability, who's responsible if it does fail, and who deals with it when it fails, and what's the failure mode? Is it the AI vendor? Is it the development team that built it? Is it the manager? a lot of questions, and each company has dealt with those in different ways. And then from a governance perspective, I would say the biggest thing for me is we're starting to see movement around governance by design. At least that's what I call it. Built-in governance at the orchestration platform layer that's proactive rather than reactive. And I think that's really important. In other words, think through the governance requirements that you have. Build in the monitoring, alerts, notifications, track what agents are doing in real time, flag abnormalities, alert humans when something goes wrong or when it seems to be wrong. Treat agent behavior the way you treat system health monitors or even human behavior, the way you would provide feedback to an employee. Documenting things, model versions, training data, deployment configurations, all those things are important. Anyway, I'm not going to belabor that. And we are actually working on some things for next year that will look at that in more detail. But governance by design, ethics by design as well, very important and a key for our successful deployment. So from an acquisition perspective, there were several of those, just to hit a few, because I'm not going to you can look back on those, but ServiceNow and MoveWorks, that was a big one, 2.85 billion in March. Signaled how enterprise software companies were starting to make the agent shift, and ServiceNow certainly deploying. MoveWorks had built a real enterprise platform, so that helped embed those capabilities in ServiceNow. Workday bought Sana for 1.1 billion in September. AI-based search and learning agents, very important from a training development perspective in the HR world. Google, made a big move acquiring Wiz for 32 billion in March. Cloud security broadly, but with agents proliferating across cloud environments, that security layer is really critical infrastructure. On the security front, generally, Palo Alto Networks went after CyberArk for around 25 billion. F5 bought Calypso AI for 180 million. Cato acquired AIM Security for agent-specific protections. Databricks acquired Textron for machine learning features, store needed for agent bricks, turning real-time data into context for agents. Infrastructure layer that made it, agents actually useful rather than just flashy or impressive, right? Funding, I've talked about this quite a lot, so I'm not going to go through the details of funding, but just suffice it to say that we've seen a lot of money flow in and continue to flow in. There's still a lot of talk about a bubble. I don't personally think that it's a bubble in a way we have thought of them in the past, particularly like the way we thought of the internet bubble. But there is some circular funding going on that creates some of that concern, I think. Standards, we still have to address a lot of those standards as well. Again, I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but I will write something up for end of the year that you can take a look at. But just as we start to get near the end here, what was I surprised by? So positive surprise, cost. I mentioned that. Model prices dropped significantly. Per token pricing for equivalent performance fell by 5x to 50x, depending on the model. Code generation quality has been really good, and definitely surprising how good the agents are at writing code. Understanding complex context, debugging, it's good. It's been very good. Experienced developers are much more productive with those tools. And that definitely wasn't something I would have necessarily guessed at the beginning of the year. Some vertical applications are definitely working better. And that's one of the things that I would say is an underlying trend. More and more industry-specific, workflow-focused agents and agent platforms solutions. That's definitely an area that we're seeing a lot of progress. Model, in medical, for example, legal, scientific. There's a lot of those domain-specific kind of use cases and agent applications that have been really good. On the downside or the disappointment side, I mean, I have mixed feelings about this one, but fully autonomous agents we're just not there yet. And you heard me talk about this already, so I'm not going to go beat that up. But it's definitely something we need to keep an eye on for next year, because a lot of the long term value is going to be in reaching that level of fully autonomous agent in certain areas. AI will replace jobs narrative. It's been something of a reality in some areas. Tasks got automated, some roles have changed, but just this wholesale job replacement that a lot of people were worried about, it hadn't really happened. I mean, some task automation, augmentation, some jobs have evolved, some disappeared, but it's probably better, and I would say it's certainly been less impactful from a job perspective than perhaps we were afraid of at the beginning of the year. ROI calculations, companies that focused on just productivity gains or labor replacement, they were disappointed and they didn't meet their goals. Reasoning, I mentioned reasoning already. Working over long horizons and persistent memory, enterprise memory, whatever you want to call it, is definitely important and something that I would continue to push on as an area where we really need a lot of improvement. So that's really what we ran into in 2025. Now, I've done a couple of prediction shows already on 2026, so I'm not going to go back through that, but I do want to hit on one area again. No surprise. Persistent memory is extremely important. Better reasoning, extremely important. Standardization and multi-agent architecture, extremely important. Regulatory clarity, I'm not going to touch that right now, I guess, but that's definitely an area where we need to see evolution here across the globe. Consolidation is starting to happen more, and I think that's just going to continue. So we need to look at how that's going to play out. And we're going to see, maturation of a lot of the conversations around agentic AI as we start to understand as it becomes more of a digital workforce paradigm. So I guess if you're leading AI initiatives in your organization, focus on specific measurable use cases and clear ROI. Particularly, remember, this is workflow, this is process reengineering, and don't just try to boil the ocean at the beginning. Pick one or two workflows and prove it out as you work across your company. Develop value, get production quality, and then learn and deploy broader. So go into that scaling process with your eyes open and with a certain amount of restraint. Governance upfront, governance by design, governance built in. Can't say that enough. Internal capabilities, we've got to do and invest in training as well. Organizational patience. So, most successful agent deployments in 2025 took time. They require iteration, learning, adjustment, just like any other implementation process. Quick pilots are good for learning, but you have to have a sustained effort to really get to that end result that you want. So, we've moved from concept to operation. It's a reality, not everywhere, not in every use case, but it is enough to say there is value and it has been a success from that perspective. We went from can this work to how do we make it work reliably at scale? That's big progress. There are a lot of challenges, but they're more about implementation than they are technology, which is good. I mean, there is still some technology that we need to evolve. Governance and organizational change absolutely play into that. So again, more focused on the implementation, less focus on the technology itself. But that's good, right? These are solvable problems, and we are learning more and more about integration. I think you're going to see more dynamic integration frameworks, more governance built in by design. We're starting to manage the organizational change better, but that is still an issue. Remember, change management is a critical part of any of these implementations. So 2026, what do we think? Well, it's about redefining what we built, seeing what worked, scaling those things that work. Building in governance if we didn't, and adjusting our process to include governance up front. Anyway, so that's I'm excited about next year. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and we will see a lot of opportunity as we go through the year evolve. And I'm looking forward to some of those technical advances that I think will actually make this much better. So I really appreciate you guys going with us this year, listening to this special, and also listening to the show. I'd love to hear about your experiences with Agentic AI in 2025. So, reach out, disambiguation at arianresearch.com or info@arianresearch.com, or email me directly, Michael at arianresearch.com. Let me know what worked, what didn't work. Reach out on LinkedIn if you want, company page or on my personal page. And, go through our website. There's a lot of good information there. Check out the books. There's a lot of good information there. So season 4, we will be back in early January, be launching that. I have some really interesting interviews lined up already. So with that, I'm going to wind up this somewhat long special. So apologize for that. Hopefully it's beneficial, has been valuable to look back. I always think it's good to take some look back, but then also look forward. So again, thank you very much for joining today. And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arianresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation at arianresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arian Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.